Welcome to Talent Buzz, where I talk about talent acquisition with fast-growing SaaS companies. Today, I am interviewing Robin Corralez from PandaDoc, and we are talking about their journey to plus 800 people, and especially how their talent acquisition function is structured, how they are measuring the success, and what kind of processes they do have in a place. And let's start with a little bit of background information, and let's go through how PandaDoc's talent acquisition team is structured.
Sure. So our teams are located all around the globe. We have about 20 people in the recruiting function right now. And they are located in literally, I believe right now it's 6 or 7 different countries that they are spanning, where they are physically located. So we have, at the highest level, I'm actually directly leading our TA function right now. And I have 4 TA leaders. Those leaders are split between, we have a revenue and general and administration revenue team. So they just focus on all revenue roles and anything that is finance, operations, and HR. Then we have a team that is focused on marketing and product. And we have a team that is focused on engineering. So we have these 3 team leads for the recruiting side, and each of them have each of the team leads have recruiters reporting into them. Their teams can be anywhere. So we can have a leader who's leading in the US. My revenue team leader is here in the US. She manages recruiters who are throughout the US, Portugal, Ukraine. It doesn't matter where they are. They can be in any country. We also have a lot of recruiters who are digital nomads. So we have recruiters who live in Turkey, recruiters who have been displaced, unfortunately, who are just living wherever they want to at this point. And then we have a recruiting operations function, and that's led by our recruiting operations manager who reports into me. And she's responsible for the recruiting coordination teams and any kind of data and analytics that we need, as well as our employment branding reports into the recruiting ops role.
Interesting structure. I think I've heard of like a lot of kind of structure, but I think typically they are different, at least kind of for the parts, because I've heard like a lot of teams where there might be a separate team for, let's say, North America and Europe or something like that, but kind of sharing those between the roles and departments, and then kind of having a separate one for the maybe kind of planning, data analytics, employer branding. So super interesting.
And we chose this structure, right? There was a lot of back and forth as we grew. When I first joined PandaDoc, there was no recruiting team that was dedicated to recruiting. It was an HR team that did recruiting and HR. So really they just did recruiting because we were scaling so fast. There was no time for them to conduct any real, valuable strategic HR activities. So one of the first things that I did was I split our recruiting and HR functions apart. We were about 250 employees at the time. It was time to have dedicated HR, and we were scaling really quickly. So it was also important to have dedicated recruiting efforts. And at that point in time, we split it geographically. We really only had 2 locations. We were in the US and we were in Belarus. And so we had recruiters who focused on the US, recruiters who focused on Belarus, and that was it. When we expanded into Manila, the US team and the Belarus team, they both started to work on Manila roles, and it was kind of dependent on timing, availability, how many roles they had on their plates in their corresponding countries. And so they were both working on Manila a little bit. And then as we continued to grow and expand, we moved into Ukraine and then Portugal and then Poland. And we didn't have the ability to just keep adding recruiters for every function for every country, because some of our offices were relatively small. So instead, we started to say, okay, how do we make this work in the best possible way? We started to have Our managers also manage globally. So it is not uncommon for a leader in the US to have direct reports in the US, Poland, Portugal, and Ukraine, right? Like, and Spain for that matter, right? Like they can have direct reports anywhere, and they prefer to work with a single TA partner. I don't want to have to figure out like who's going to recruit for me in this country versus another country. So for the reasons of both scalability of our team and being good business partners to our leaders, we felt that functional expertise was going to be a little bit of a better structure. Now, there's a lot of challenges with that. You have time zones restrictions. So when you are in Ukraine and you are recruiting for someone who is located and you're trying to screen candidates who are in San Francisco, that's a really big time zone stretch. And sometimes it happens. But we find that we can generally meet with some flexibility because we do hire globally. So we don't care where people are located. So we're not necessarily hiring for a specific country any longer. We say we want to find the best talent wherever they're at. And so having recruiters who have a global focus and can recruit functionally versus geographically opens up our talent pool. So that was the major catalyst for the decision. Again, it's tricky, right? Like we've gone into new markets and we have zero idea what we're doing in that market. When we opened up Portugal, we didn't understand employment laws. We didn't understand comp. We were talking to people, who would ask us a ton of questions that we didn't quite frankly know the answers to. But when we enter a new country, we make a diligent effort to at least try to understand some of the basics so that we can talk to people. And then we're just resourceful at getting information back to candidates. So we collect, and now we have playbooks for every country that explains what the employment conditions are in those countries for the countries where we hire full time. And then for countries where we don't have an entity, we offer a digital nomad option. And so the conditions around that type of employment is all the same. So it was a little bumpy of a transition at first, but over time, the team really, now they all have global capabilities, which is a great thing for for everyone from a junior recruiter to a senior recruiter to say, I am a global recruiter. So everyone on my team can say that.
For sure. And I think whether you go with the function base or like area base, I think both of those models, they have their pros and cons, and it's just kind of figuring out which is the best one for you. But you mentioned there, for example, opening up new markets and how to go from there. Are you doing everything internally, or are you, for example, using agencies when you are opening up new markets, or everything in-house?
It is primarily in-house. When we first opened in Ukraine, the market was so tight. We opened our Ukraine office in 2020. Yeah, it was the end of 2020. And at that point in time, there were probably 5 offers to every engineer, right? So every engineer had at least 5 offers to select from. We were struggling with employment branding. We were relatively unknown. And so we spoke to a lot of agencies to get intelligence on the market. We tried to partner with agencies, but really weren't very successful. So we found that having us like just go into market was, and trial and error was a better approach. And we did a little bit of employment branding. We had our CEO and our CTO, our co-founders, do a little bit of publicity in those markets. Our CEO is relatively well known throughout Eastern Europe. And so that didn't hurt our ability when we first entered the market. But the same thing when we entered Portugal, we learned a little bit from Ukraine, and instead we hired a local recruiter first. It was the first thing we did, who could help us understand that talent market, and help us build the office. So that was like the first hire that we made was an HR hire who did HR and talent acquisition, who could enable the rest of the teams to be successful when tapping into that market. But primarily it's all internal. We don't use a whole lot of agencies.
Yeah, interesting. And it's weird, even though I'm running a recruitment agency, I still believe that companies should own their own talent acquisition function, because I think it is just like when you are growing, it is the key function of the company. If you are unable to get those players in, you won't be able to scale the company. So I think it is great to own that one. I think the question is like when, and then like, yeah, there might be places where it makes sense to use agencies. And of course, it depends on the resources as well. Like if you have kind of enough resources on going to new market, you already know that you are hiring a lot of people on that market. Then at the same time, like if you are building the TA function there, like why not build it from the scratch from the beginning?
Yeah, and we make conscious decisions around agency partners when bandwidth, right, like doesn't allow for us to have enough focus. So in 2020, the end of 2021, tech markets were scaling dramatically, right? And talent competition was getting insane. So we had talent partners. We would work with agency partners in each of the countries to help us identify and find key talent, because we needed to add them so quickly. And we just didn't have the resources internally. This was also when you could not find a recruiter. So, there were hundreds of thousands of open recs for recruiters. And then you're trying to fill those positions in order to fill your internal positions. And it was like this talent catastrophe at the time. I just remember every night I'd lay awake and I'd say, oh my God, I have 120 open roles. How are we going to fill them when I have no recruiting team? Like this is insane. And so we identified several talent agencies to help us with our recruiting efforts at that time.
Yeah. It's interesting to see like how the times changes, and I think recruitment is one of the industry that goes up and down, and it's just kind of nature of the business over there. But what would be super interesting to learn, you are quite a big company. Like, how do you do the kind of resource planning in a way that, like, when you are hiring people and all that, big recruitment team, a lot of hiring managers, multiple countries, like, how do you plan? Like, when to hire, who to hire? Like, it must be a big puzzle to solve.
It is a big puzzle to solve. So generally speaking, we do quarterly planning sessions. Generally speaking, we have an annual plan. So our finance partners and our HR partners work alongside of each of the business leaders to identify what are the talent gaps inside of the organization and what are we going to hire for the following year. And so when we do that, we build a plan that outlines how many individuals per quarter will we be adding. In addition to that, we start to take into consideration what is our anticipated attrition going to be, and are there any differences? Do we expect differences by country? Do we expect differences by department? And so that we can understand at a departmental level, what are we anticipating our hiring needs for the following year will be? So that's where we start, right? But the best laid plans in technology in a very fast changing environment, with global external factors as well as internal factors and economic factors, even the best laid plans go south very quickly, right? So it never fails. We're halfway through the first quarter and the hiring plan is like, nope, that's not what we're doing anymore. We're either scaling up, we're scaling back, and we're trying to figure out what we're doing differently. Again, we work with our finance partners really closely because it's mostly going to be budget restrictions or budget opening is going to help influence our hiring plans. So we work really closely with them to forecast what do we need for our talent. And then we're trickling that information back down to our recruiters and our recruiting teams so that they have an understanding of what the forecast will look like for hiring. Now, in 2021, that was really difficult, and our process was really immature because we weren't used to scaling so fast. And we had hired 450 people in 2021. I think our initial hiring plan had called for maybe 200. And we hired 450 because of the tailwinds that we saw in our business in 2022 and the increased attrition, because you may remember 2021 was the great resignation or whatever. So like everybody was looking for a new job at the time. So we had higher than anticipated attrition as well. In 2022, the conditions for hiring got much harder during the first half of the year. And then our conditions for hiring got even harder as we lost 3 key markets that we were recruiting in. So impacted by the war in Ukraine, it impacted our Eastern European efforts tremendously. So we had to go look for talent in Western Europe, especially for our engineering talent, which made things much more difficult on our team. So we only hired about 300. I think we hired about 350 people in 2022. But that was against an expected plan of probably 450. So we had expected to hire 450, but as things started to scale back in the second half of the year, we slowed our hiring too. So we cut positions out of our plan in anticipation for what was going to be a much greater, tighter economic situation. And we did that in advance, which is good. So we stopped hiring instead of hiring and then having to do layoffs, which we've seen across the technology sector. But that planning, it's a really delicate balance. But in concert with our finance partners, our business leaders, and then our TA leads, it's a little bit easier to ensure that we know what we're doing. I will not lie to you. We have a lot of Excel spreadsheet or Google Sheets. We utilize Greenhouse, but there's a lot of Google Sheets, and there's always a lot of comments on each of them that says, is this position really open? Not open? It never fails, right? We're just like every other company. We have our own we have challenges.
Yeah, I think it's with every company out there. But maybe from the Greenhouse and Google Sheets, would be interesting to hear a bit about the metrics and like how you are able to lead such a big team. So what are the kind of key metrics that you are following in your talent acquisition and making sure that it is kind of going in the right direction?
Yeah. So we look at time to fill, right? Just like nearly every company does. So we have our standard recruiting metrics, time to fill, hiring velocity, right? Which is how quickly are we moving candidates through our pipelines. We have established SLAs for each step of our process. So being that, like, how quickly are we opening jobs from the time that they are approved? How quickly are our candidates or our hiring teams completing scorecards in order to move candidates through the pipeline. And so we look at each of these SLAs on a regular basis, and Greenhouse is kind enough to give us dashboards to tell us, right? Like, how are we performing against them? So we have all of those, but then there's the qualitative metrics of recruiting. And so we've recently built an hiring manager NPS system, where we can survey our hiring managers on how they feel about the recruiting partners they're working with. We also take candidate feedback into consideration. So that's something we've been doing for years. But we have a post-interview candidate survey that goes out where we want to understand how they felt along the process. And we ask several questions of those individuals so that we can improve our process, share feedback with recruiting teams, with hiring managers, and other key interviewers on what our candidate experience looks like. So those are the more qualitative metrics.
Mm. Exactly. But one kind of interesting take from me, tell me what you think regarding the kind of time to fill or kind of how long the recruitment process is. I've been lately thinking, like, a lot of companies are trying to push that number down, but what we have been actually trying to do for ourselves is push that number up. And I explained this a bit. So I think the reason why companies are trying to get the time to fill kind of to low number is the fact that most companies are doing their recruitment in a kind of ad hoc way. So they realized that, oh shit, now we need a salesperson or now we need a developer. Rather than kind of if you could really kind of plan those ahead. And I completely understand the kind of when you are in a fast growth, it is super super hard to do that one. But for example, for our kind of business where we are, talent acquisition agency, mainly hiring recruiters and employer branding persons, like we know that those are the people we want to hire. And for example, if I look at our two latest hires, or actually let's say the latest hire, Nora, her recruitment process was basically 8 months. And it sounds long, yeah. But now when I explain it, it hopefully makes more sense. So I, I don't think recruitment process should be that long. But the first point of contact was roughly 8 months ago. We had a quick chat. We weren't hiring at that stage. Like we couldn't hire at that stage. But we know that like on the road, we are hiring these kind of people. And we kind of started to build the relationship. And there was, multiple touch points. There was, of course, those interviews, some case task. But then, for example, like we are building a community of recruiters and, having a Slack channel. I think she participated one of our dinners together. And, it was long process. And kind of neither party was in a situation where like they needed, or we needed to hire right now, or she needed a workplace right now. But then kind of what ended up happening was the moment we were able to hire and she was in a position that, hey, she would like a new job. Like then things happened, super, super quickly. And I think one of the big benefits of that one is compared to, ad hoc recruitment is that typically, those people you find when you need to like fill the role, let's say in 4 weeks, those are typically not people who really want to join your company. They are typically people who are running away from somewhere. But when you actually gonna get that kind of recruitment process in a longer way, then those are really people who want to join exactly your company. And of course, I think we can have a long discussion whether it's really a recruitment process or does it code to actually employer branding and that person has been following your company for a long time. But like what do you think on that one?
So I agree with the approach of pipelining, right? So the way that I think about that is that if your recruiting team and your employer branding team are working on developing communities and building a solid pipeline of individuals where they have these established relationships, then your time to fill is going to be reduced, right? Like I operate on that premise that if I have a stable of people that I can reach out to and say, hey, you know what? I know we talked a long time ago and I think you're an amazing product manager. We have an opening for a product manager now. I can condense that time to hire from what would normally be 60, 65 days to hire a product manager down to 3 weeks, right? Like I can get that position filled in 21 days to get through the interview process if I have that stable of candidates. And so I agree with it. It's just where you measure, and how do you measure what your stable pool of candidates is? That's the part that I haven't cracked, right? Like I don't know how to measure the relationship building aspects of recruitment outside of reducing the time to fill, right? So I'm like, if we're doing all the things upstream, then our downstream output of time to fill should be lower.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, yeah, it's a lot about kind of where you measure. Like, do you measure from the point when you realize that, hey, now I can hire, or from some other moment? And for the quality, it is hard. Like one thing that we've been testing for kind of our own community. So we have a Slack channel, and then we have actually this monthly session. It's called Hive of Talents, and we have monthly session for recruiters, employer branding persons, where we basically typically we give a kind of introduction to a kind of certain topic for the day. Last time, for example, we discussed how AI will be changing talent acquisition, and then we kind of workshop around the topic together. And basically how we are measuring the success of that one is basically like how big part of those people that are invited for that one are coming that kind of sells, I would say, two things for us. Like, first of all, is the stuff we are sharing there is valuable for those individuals, and then secondly, like, are they really interested about like working at Talent B someday or not? But of course, eventually, I think comes down to the moment when we are like, now we need someone fast. Are we able to hire someone from the fast? Exactly. But yeah, not easy for sure. Not easy for sure. How do you make sure that your employer branding and recruitments are kind of aligned? Because I feel like that is a challenge for a lot of companies. Kind of same. I have background from sales and marketing. Every company struggles with aligning sales and marketing, and I feel like employer branding, recruitments, a lot of similarities over there. But
So we've put employer branding inside of recruiting operations. And I think that's one of the ways that we've done it because we manage it centrally. And our recruiting ops function is always aware of what is coming, right? So they are there to ensure that they know what the next positions are. They're also able to utilize the data and analytics of how quickly are we filling in different markets, where are we seeing challenges, and then apply that to how do we utilize our employer branding efforts. We don't have large scale employer branding efforts. We're really good as a marketing company, right? Like PandaDoc is a sales and marketing enablement organization. And so we're really good at sales and marketing. We're not as great at employment branding, and we're kind of in the infancy of it. A few reasons for that are that we never had to have a strong employment brand because we were just known, right? We just had one in the countries where we where we operated previously. We're finding that we need to do more around employment branding in each market because we're an unknown in countries where we're operating. But by having recruiting operations utilize the data and the information that is available to them and then have that drive the employer branding focus, I think it's more tightly connected.
that makes sense. And I think it's kind of first great step, as you mentioned, like having the employer branding, part as the talent acquisition function. I've had lately a lot of discussions like who should be owning employer branding, like whether it's the talent acquisition or marketing. And I feel like most companies it is kind of under marketing. And I'm not saying it's bad, but like in my opinion, it should be rather on like under the talent acquisition. Make sure it's aligned with marketing, tone of voice, everything like that. But I think that's a great way of starting and getting those aligned.
And we partner really closely with marketing. So, our employer branding specialist works really closely and pulls resources from the marketing team. So we're not developing our own content, right? So we don't have to worry about tone of voice because we're working in concert with marketing in order to drive the content. So we know that we're aligned. Because we're pulling marketing resources. Now that can also be a challenge, right? Because marketing is being pulled by marketing, and then we're like a client of the marketing function instead of a part of the marketing function. So sometimes there's competition for resources, and it may be a little bit tougher. But in general, our marketing teams want to be a part of the employer branding because that's the fun stuff for them. They're like, we get to have more fun when it's employer branding versus professional output of marketing. So there's a lot more flexibility with what kind of content you can publish and how you can reach your audiences. And you're targeting a different audience than you are for our marketing teams. So they enjoy it because it gives them like a different creative outlet. And so generally speaking, they want to be a part of our employer branding efforts.
Yeah, exactly. What happens? I'm thinking like kind of you are quite a big company, big recruitment team, and I think when you are going there, you need to have clear structure and maybe some kind of scorecard for the interviews to make sure like whoever is doing the recruitment, you are making kind of fair decisions and all that. But how do you think kind of you should draw the line over there that the recruiters, they don't feel like, hey, I'm a robot coming to do this process, but also making sure that they can be themselves while doing recruitment? So like kind of where do you draw the line between having super strict process on everything and then kind of having everyone do things their way?
It's a great question. One of our strategic initiatives for 2023 has been to really improve our recruiting processes overall, because despite our growth, we really didn't have a lot of solid consistency. I mean, yes, we have solid scorecard, right? Like consistent scorecards. What are the attributes that we're rating candidates on? And that's based on feedback from the managers of what they're looking for, right? So like those sort of things were in play. But we didn't have real strong standardized templates for our recruiting efforts and our outreach. Did not have not necessarily have consistent interview questions that every recruiter was required to offer. And so we've been implementing more strict process this year. It's being met with some resistance and some challenges. Like, of course, timing is everything, right? Like some stuff blew up last week where some recruiters were not very happy with templates that were being developed. I suddenly felt like I was on the sales side, and we had the same challenge with salespeople when we started to implement more basic prospecting templates. I was like, wow, what is happening? But we've, like in dissecting what took place last week, right? We said that there are best practices around this because we have been able to implement standardization in a much better way with managing the change. And the way that we've done that in the past that we didn't necessarily do in this particular instance was that we engaged the recruiting team, right? So soliciting the feedback from the team at large goes a tremendous way of getting their buy-in on implementation of standards. And we had a cross-recruiting functional team. We had a cross-functional team of recruiters who worked on the project, but we missed the step of getting everyone to buy in. So we had the people who wrote the things, right? Like they were all bought in, but we never really got the rest of the team's feedback. And we made an assumption that the individuals who were representing the team were going to be collaborating with their peers, right? Like that was just an assumed item that was not at all true. So when it came time to go to implementation, there were people who didn't necessarily agree with what had been done. But when you solicit the feedback from the global team and you allow them the inputs and not everyone's voice, you don't actually have to take everyone's opinion and make an action that, right? Like, and make the changes. But I have a belief that reasonable people want to be heard and they just need to feel as though they've been listened to. So, and then the other thing is experimentation, right? So like, I find that you can get so much more buy-in on process if you position it as, we're going to try this out. We're probably going to make mistakes. It might not work for you, but let's try it, collect feedback, and then we can test again. And so I believe that creates more buy-in because then individuals don't feel like this is a permanent change forever and I'm not going to have any say in it, but rather let's test and iterate, which is very much part of a startup culture to begin with. And so large companies tend to lose the test and iterate, and they forget that that's how they grew to where they are. And so by maintaining test, implement, test, iterate processes, I think you can get a lot more buy-in from your recruiting team because they feel like they're part of the process of improvement.
And that's a wrap for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. Hopefully you got a lot of good ideas about SaaS talent acquisition. If you enjoyed the episode, feel free to share it on your social so others can hear it too. And if you have a topic in mind that you would like me to cover in this podcast, share it with me as well. I'm Samuli, CEO and co-founder in TalentBee, where we help fast-growing SaaS companies in their talent acquisition. Make sure to follow us, make sure to follow this podcast, and have an awesome week. Bye-bye.